Okay, so in this video, we're going to continue going through chapter 20, which is still about the Western Hemisphere. And in this one, we're going to be looking at what's going on in South America. So what we'll notice in South America is that a lot of the same ideas that happened in Central America are going to be reflected in South America. So there's not a lot of trade or diffusion between Central and South America. There is some, but not a lot. And most of this has to do with the lack of draft animals. As we've noted previously, the largest animal in the Western Hemisphere is the llama. And llamas are kind of notoriously difficult to work with. And so there's just not a lot of trade. There's some, but it all has to be done on foot. And we'll see some of these interactions as we talk about South America, but they're not many. Like what we saw in Central America, if we start back in time period 1, the first society here kind of picks up around 900 BCE, and it's called the Chauvin Society. And it's kind of in kind of northern South America. There's not a whole lot that's known about the Chauvin Society, and there's not much we need to know about the Chauvin Society. But we do know that they did agriculture, along a river valley, much like what we saw in Eurasia. They were also religiously focused on human sacrifice. And that the jaguar was an important symbol. And much like what we saw in Central America with the Olmecs, these ideas of the Chauvin Society are going to continue through the other societies that emerge in South America. So as we get into time period 2, we get the Moche Society, which was also kind of in the northwestern South America, in the Andes Mountains. Now, within Moche Society, there were city-states, much like the Maya had Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza. There were city-states here too. Notably Chiquito and Chimu, kind of on the Pacific coast of South America. But eventually, Moche Society became dominated by another city-state. And it was called Cuzco. So Cuzco was the major city as we go into time period 3. So Cuzco was the capital of the Inca Empire. Which is kind of centered in what is now Peru. In fact, Cuzco is still a city in Peru, kind of in southern Peru. Inca is a word that means ruler. So calling it the Inca Empire is kind of saying the same word twice. So really we would just call them the Inca. Now, here's the thing about the Inca that might sound familiar. Again, kind of reminiscent of how the Mongols did things. There weren't a lot of Inca people. Just like there weren't a lot of Mongol people. And so what the Inca did is, as they took territory, they also took hostages. So as they took territory, they also took hostages, usually children. And they took them back to Cuzco. And when they did that, they would send loyal Inca from Cuzco to the newly conquered territory. And doing this was kind of a form of forced cultural diffusion. The children were raised as loyal Inca, like learning the language, and customs and culture. And the children were raised as Inca, and the loyal Inca sent out to the territories taught those people Inca language and custom. They also knew or they, I guess, told the people out in the territories that if they were to try to go get their children back, they would be killed. So it was a means of keeping everybody nice and peaceful, and at the same time learning cultural traditions of the people that are now in charge. So as Cusco grew, they built lots of roads to connect their empire. They also built lots of public works, like any other empire would do. Specifically, they're known for building storehouses for grain, but they also built things like post offices, roads, temples. One of the other interesting things about Inca society is that they had no written language. As we've noticed in other societies, language originally is formed as a way of keeping records. So they had no written language, but they did have a method of record keeping. And it was called a quipu. So a quipu was a series of ropes of different color that are strung together. And you tie knots in it to indicate quantities. So you'd have these ropes hanging from like a central rope. They're different colors, indicating different things, and you tie a knot in it to indicate how much of that thing you had. I think there's a picture of it in your textbook. Like we saw in Aztec society, the merchants here were also controlled by the government. So all the trade was done to fund the government, just like it was done in Central America. Finally, like we did in Aztec society, we'll end with a little bit of discussion of the religion here. And here we'll probably see the biggest interaction between Central America and South America, in that there is a lot of sacrifice was very connected to religious belief. So the rulers were kind of the speakers for the gods. And they were often mummified after they died. And they were brought out on special occasions. Now, the sacrifices come in the form of children. So, children were often sacrificed. And the reason children were sacrificed is that they wanted the gods to be amongst the best the Inca society had to offer. And so the strongest children were usually sacrificed. Some of these children, some ended up mummified, usually through just exposure to the elements. So a lot of them froze to death on very tall mountains. And at that altitude, in a very dry, environment, the corpses were mummified. And so we even have a pretty good idea of what they ate, what their last meals were, because their bodies were so well preserved. And usually the children were sacrificed during periods of natural disaster, or for special occasions on their calendars. But again, a lot of what we know about Inca society comes from the Spanish, who are going to come around at the beginning of the 1500s and conquer them. So a lot of what we know about the Inca comes secondhand through the Spanish or through archaeological or anthropological research, like we might do during the hunter and gatherer periods when we don't really have a written record of what was going on. So I'll stop there. The last video on this chapter and our last video on time period 3 is coming up, and that's on what's going on in North America and in Oceania right before time period 4 starts. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.